Marina Ellison, Colt Ellison, and Darren Hale, 3 names tied together by a secret affair. A storm-soaked night, and a crime so chilling that only a silent child was left to reveal the truth. Redbrook was the kind of place that looked peaceful even on its busiest days. Rows of maple trees lined the streets, their branches forming quiet tunnels of shade during summer and bright bursts of color in fall. Most families had lived there for generations, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's routines. It was the sort of town people described as safe, predictable, and comforting. Yet beneath the soft glow of familiarity, small cracks were beginning to form, cracks no one noticed until it was too late. Marina Ellison had moved to Redbrook 5 years earlier. She liked how calm the town felt compared to the city she grew up in. Her house sat at the very edge of a cul-de-sac, a modest single-story home with white shutters and a small garden she tended whenever she had a free hour. Life had not been simple for her, but she carried herself with a quiet strength that made others admire her. With her husband working overseas for long stretches of time, she often managed the household alone. Even now, while 7 months pregnant, she continued balancing her job, her home, and her 3-year-old son, Colt, without letting exhaustion show. Colt was a gentle, observant child. He followed Marina almost everywhere, often carrying the same small blue truck in his hands. Neighbors frequently saw him toddling behind her in the yard or riding his tiny tricycle across the driveway. He rarely caused trouble, and his silence often made him seem older than he was. In a place like Redbrook, people viewed him as just another familiar part of the neighborhood scenery, unaware of how important his presence would later become. Life inside Marina's home was quiet but busy. Most mornings began before sunrise. She would prepare breakfast for Colt, sort laundry, review emails from her accounting job, and make sure she was ready for work before dropping him off at a nearby daycare. Despite her growing pregnancy, she never seemed to slow down. She believed that keeping a routine helped her stay focused when loneliness threatened to creep in. The long-distance marriage was difficult, but she never complained. She simply adjusted, the way she always had. Yet behind Marina's steady exterior, a subtle tension had been building. She had recently taken on more responsibilities at work, trying to provide more financial stability for her expanding family. The increased workload meant longer hours, more stress, and more interactions with coworkers. Most were friendly in a harmless way, but one person had begun to stand out, someone who paid more attention to her than necessary. Marina never discussed these details with her neighbors. She kept personal matters private, as she believed every family had its struggles. In the evenings, when the streetlights flickered on and porch lights glowed softly across the cul-de-sac, Marina often sat on her front steps while Colt played with his toys nearby. She would place a hand on her growing stomach, watching the leaves move gently with the wind. She felt tired, hopeful, and worried all at once. Redbrook's peaceful surroundings made her believe everything would be fine, but a faint sense of unease sometimes stirred in her mind, too light to understand, yet too persistent to ignore. No one in Redbrook suspected that beneath the calm appearance of Marina's life, a dangerous chain of events had already begun. And no one imagined that the smallest person in her home, innocent, quiet Colt, would soon become the only one who truly knew what happened behind the closed doors of that white-shuttered house. Marina's new job at the accounting firm had seemed harmless at first. It offered flexible hours, a supportive environment, and a paycheck that made raising a small child a little easier. She had joined the firm only 6 months earlier, and during that time she immersed herself in work, determined to prove she could handle anything despite her pregnancy and the challenges of raising Colt alone. The office building sat in the center of Redbrook, a modest structure with glass windows that reflected the town's slow-moving life. Inside, everything felt organized, predictable, and professional, at least on the surface. Among the team members was Darren Hale, a coworker who had joined around the same time as Marina. He was confident, well-dressed, and known for his ability to charm anyone he spoke with. At first, Marina appreciated his friendliness. He made the long workdays feel less lonely, and his willingness to help with projects made her job easier. She thought of him as nothing more than a colleague who understood the stress of adjusting to a new workplace. That harmless comfort slowly grew into something more complicated, though Marina didn't recognize it immediately. Over the weeks, Darren's attention became noticeably stronger. He began stopping by her desk more often than necessary, offering small treats he claimed were for the baby or checking up on her after meetings. Marina tried to ignore the signs, assuming he was just being kind. But there was something in the way he lingered near her, something in the way he seemed to watch her when she wasn't looking. His interest did not feel dangerous, at first just unexpected. And Marina, often feeling isolated because of her husband's absence, didn't know how to react without seeming rude. As time passed, the connection deepened beyond casual friendliness. Marina found herself confiding in Darren about work stress, motherhood, and the challenges of maintaining a long-distance marriage. Darren listened closely, giving her the attention and validation she hadn't felt in a long time. What she didn't realize was that Darren interpreted every word differently. In his mind, her vulnerability meant she needed him. The more she shared, the more convinced he became that he was becoming an important part of her life. Their interactions shifted from simple conversations to moments that felt heavy with unspoken meaning. Marina sensed the shift, but wasn't sure how to address it. She felt guilty, as though she had allowed something to grow without stopping it early enough. Yet another part of her, tired, overwhelmed, and emotionally stretched, found comfort in the company. The affair began quietly, almost unnoticed, slipping into her life like a shadow that slowly expanded. But the brief sense of relief it gave her never lasted long. She worried constantly about being discovered, worried about her husband finding out, worried about the future of her growing family. Darren, however, seemed energized by the secrecy. He became bolder, more eager, more present. Marina realized too late that what she had treated as a temporary escape, Darren viewed as a deep, unbreakable bond. When she finally decided to end the relationship, she believed it would be simple. She assumed Darren would accept it and move on. She had underestimated the intensity of his attachment. She had misunderstood the way he saw her, the way he interpreted every moment between them. What began as a distraction for her had become an obsession for him. And that obsession was about to turn into something dark, something she never imagined could happen in a quiet town like Redbrook. Marina had reached a point where the weight of the secret she carried felt heavier than her growing pregnancy. What had started as a temporary lapse, an emotional escape from loneliness, had become a constant source of fear. Every morning she woke with a sense of unease, as if she were walking on ground that could collapse at any moment. She knew the affair had been a mistake. She knew she had to end it before it damaged her family, her career, and her peace. But ending it was not as simple as she had hoped. Because Darren had quietly crossed lines she had not noticed soon enough, she began by pulling away at work. She stopped staying late to finish projects with him, stopped accepting small favors, and avoided personal conversations. She changed where she sat during meetings, choosing seats near other colleagues. She adjusted her lunch schedule so their breaks never overlapped. These small, careful movements were her way of reclaiming the boundaries she had carelessly allowed to fade. She hoped he would see the distance and understand without confrontation. But Darren noticed every shift, every change, every attempt to detach. At first, he tried to regain her attention through harmless gestures, leaving coffee on her desk, sending brief messages asking how she was feeling, offering help on tasks she didn't need assistance with. Marina politely ignored him, thinking he would eventually stop. Instead, his behavior grew more intense. The messages became longer, more emotional, filled with implications she didn't want to acknowledge. When she didn't respond, he sent more. When she avoided him in the office, He appeared in hallways she walked through, quietly watching her, waiting for a moment she couldn't escape. The situation worsened when he began showing up outside of work. One evening, as Marina carried groceries into her house, she noticed Darren's car parked near the corner of her street. She convinced herself it was just a coincidence, but the following week he appeared again. Each sighting tightened the knot of anxiety in her chest. She tried to hide her fear from Colt, who remained unaware of the growing tension. Marina knew she needed to act before things spiraled into something she couldn't control. Her final decision came during a quiet morning at the office. She approached her manager privately and reported Darren's behavior. She didn't go into details about the affair. She simply explained that Darren had become intrusive, persistent, and uncomfortable to be around. The manager assured her the situation would be handled discreetly. Marina left the office that day, believing she had taken the first step toward safety. She hoped the intervention would make Darren back off and allow her life to settle again. But the report did not have the effect she expected. Rather than pulling away, Darren became unpredictable. The moment he sensed he was losing control, something inside him shifted. He started calling her late at night, though she never answered. He sent long, emotional emails she deleted without reading. His tone changed from affectionate to desperate, then to cold and unsettling. She could feel his anger even through silent screens. Every day Marina left work with a growing sense of dread, checking over her shoulder before walking to her car. She kept her curtains closed at home, double-checked her locks, and avoided leaving the house after dark. Her once calm life felt like a trap tightening around her. What she didn't realize was that Darren had convinced himself that Marina belonged to him. In his mind, the affair had not been a mistake, but a promise he believed she was breaking. And as Marina struggled to regain control of her life, Darren was already planning how he would take it back, no matter the cost. The night the storm rolled into Redbrook, the town seemed to shrink under the weight of the dark clouds gathering overhead. By late afternoon, the sky had turned an unsettling shade of gray, and a thick humidity clung to the air, as if warning residents that something harsh was on its way. Weather alerts echoed across phones and radios, advising everyone to stay indoors. As the first heavy drops of rain fell, Marina felt an uneasiness that had been growing for weeks settle deeper inside her. She couldn't explain it, but something about the storm seemed too perfectly timed, too consuming, as if it were connected to the tension she had been trying so hard to escape. Inside her house, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. She made a simple dinner, cleaned up the dishes, and helped Colt into his pajamas. He sat quietly on the living room rug, pushing his blue truck back and forth, unaffected by the rising wind outside. The calmness of her son was a small comfort, but it didn't ease the tightening in her chest. She checked the windows twice, then walked through the house, making sure each door was locked. The storm was growing louder, pounding against the roof and rattling the shutters in a way that made the whole structure seem alive. When a sharp crack of thunder shook the walls, Marina jumped. The sudden boom reminded her how vulnerable she felt in the house, especially with her husband thousands of miles away. She tried to distract herself by organizing a stack of bills on the kitchen counter, but her mind kept drifting back to Darren. His behavior had been escalating, his messages growing stranger, his presence more intrusive. She had blocked his number, but the memory of his desperation clung to her like a shadow. She tried telling herself he wouldn't dare come near her house again, not after the report at work, but she didn't fully believe it. As the storm intensified, flashes of lightning illuminated the neighborhood. Trees bent under the pressure of the wind, and rain splattered so hard against the windows it was almost impossible to see outside. Marina's nerves were on edge. Every sound felt amplified, the creaking of the walls, the shaking of the gutters, the faint whistle of wind squeezing through the sides of the door. She gathered Colt in her arms and carried him to his room, gently placing him in bed. His innocence, His trust in her protection made her even more determined to stay alert. Night settled fully, and the storm grew ferocious. Marina turned off the lights, leaving only a dim lamp glowing in the hallway. She stood in the living room for a long moment, listening to the relentless roar outside. Then she heard a softer sound, something that didn't belong to the storm. A faint crunch, a shift of weight, a disturbance near the side of the house. Her breath caught. She moved slowly toward the window, careful to keep her silhouette away from the glass. The yard was too dark to see anything, but the sound came again, barely audible over the rain. Marina's heartbeat quickened. She backed away, her instincts screaming that she was not alone. She checked the lock on the back door again, pressing her hand against the cold metal as if she could reinforce it with her touch. The house felt smaller now, as though danger was pressing in from all sides. She considered calling someone, a neighbor, her husband, the police, but she hesitated, not wanting to overreact. That hesitation was the first moment the storm swallowed her entirely. While the wind howled and lightning tore through the sky, she had no idea that someone stood just beyond the shadows of her home, unmoved by the weather, watching with a determination that ignored every barrier she had tried to build. The storm gave cover, noise, and darkness, everything he needed. And as Marina tried to convince herself she was imagining things, the night was already shifting into something she would never escape. The following morning, the peaceful routine of Redbrook was shattered before anyone even realized something was wrong. Dawn had barely begun to lighten the sky when a neighbor walking her dog noticed that Marina's front door was not fully closed. It hung slightly ajar, moving back and forth in the breeze left behind by the night's violent storm. At first, the neighbor assumed the wind had blown it open, but something about the stillness inside the house felt unsettling. She called out Marina's name once and again, but heard nothing in return, not footsteps, not movement, not even the familiar sound of Colt's toys clattering across the floor. The dog began to whine, sensing the tension in the air. When the neighbor stepped cautiously closer, she saw something on the floor just beyond the threshold, one of Colt's small toy trucks lying on its side. She knew Marina was careful and never left the door open, especially with a child in the house. That was the moment her worry solidified into fear. She backed away quickly and called the police, her hands trembling as she explained what she saw and how unlike Marina it was to leave her home exposed. By the time officers arrived, the rising sun revealed the remnants of the storm, fallen branches, puddles reflecting pale morning light, and debris scattered across lawns. But nothing looked as alarming as the silent open door of Marina Ellison's house. The officers entered cautiously, announcing themselves as they moved from room to room. Inside, the air felt heavy, as though the storm had left something more than rain behind. They reached the kitchen first, and there they found Marina. She was lying on the floor, still and pale, surrounded by signs of a struggle. A broken vase lay near the counter, and a chair had been knocked sideways. Nothing about the scene looked accidental. What stood out most, however, was the eerie quiet. There were no footsteps, no sounds of movement, only the distant hum of the refrigerator filling the silence of the room. Then, as officers moved through the hallway, they found Colt. The 3-year-old was sitting on the floor, clutching his blue toy truck tightly in both hands. His wide eyes were unfocused, as if he were staring at something far away that only he could see. He wasn't crying. He wasn't talking. He wasn't even reacting to the strangers entering the house. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his expression blank, his tiny body motionless, except for a slow, rhythmic rocking. The innocence of his presence in such a terrible scene made the moment feel even heavier. One officer knelt beside him, speaking gently, but Colt didn't respond. It was as though the events of the night had frozen him inside himself. There were no visible injuries on him, no sign that he had been touched or harmed, but the shock in his eyes suggested he had seen far more than any child ever should. He was, in every sense, the silent witness to whatever had happened inside that home. As investigators secured the scene, they noted the lack of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact. Nothing had been broken from the outside. Whoever entered the house had either been let in or had known how to enter without drawing attention. Combined with the evidence of struggle near the kitchen, the detectives quickly realized this was not a random act of violence. It was targeted, personal. Colt was gently carried outside and placed in the arms of a calming officer while paramedics examined him. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply held his truck tighter, his small fingers wrapped around it as though it were the only thing connecting him to familiar life. The town of Redbrook would wake up within the hour. Parents would prepare breakfast, children would return to their routines, and neighbors would step outside to inspect the storm damage. None of them knew that within Marina's quiet home, a tragedy had unfolded, one witnessed only by a small child too young to understand what he had seen, yet the only person who had been present when everything changed forever. Investigators immediately sealed off Marina's home, marking it as the center of what was clearly a deliberate and personal crime. As crime scene technicians worked inside, detectives began the difficult task of piecing together the final hours of Marina Ellison's life. The storm had washed away any footprints outside, and the violent wind had scattered debris across the yard, making it hard to determine whether anyone had approached the house overnight. But inside, the clues painted a clearer picture, one of growing conflict and sudden violence. Detective Rowan Clark, a seasoned investigator who had solved numerous domestic-related cases, took the lead. She carefully walked through the kitchen, examining the position of Marina's body, the broken vase, the overturned chair, and the scattered items on the counter. Every detail suggested a struggle that escalated quickly. Marina had likely tried to fight back, despite her pregnancy making movement difficult. The angle of the injuries, the defensive wounds on her arms, and the signs of resistance indicated she had known her attacker. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was something far more personal. The absence of forced entry immediately narrowed the focus. Someone Marina trusted, or at least someone she knew, had entered the house. Rowan's attention turned to the electronics on the kitchen table. Marina's phone was found with a cracked screen, as if it had been thrown or stepped on during the struggle. Technicians began recovering its data, hoping the digital trail would reveal what the storm had hidden. Hours later, when they accessed Marina's messages, the investigators found a series of deleted conversations with Darren Hale. Tone of these messages grew increasingly intense, shifting from affection to frustration, and finally to unsettling desperation. Darren had sent multiple messages the day before the storm, asking where Marina was and why she wasn't responding. Some of the deleted messages hinted at arguments, emotional pressure, and attempts to make her feel guilty for pulling away. This discovery immediately placed him at the top of the suspect list. Detectives also visited the accounting firm where Marina worked. Her supervisor confirmed that she had recently filed a complaint regarding Darren's behavior. She hadn't disclosed all the details, but she had mentioned persistent unwanted attention. Other coworkers described Darren as overly fixated on her, often hovering near her desk or attempting conversations she clearly didn't want. Several employees recalled seeing Marina appear stressed and withdrawn in the days leading up to her death. When investigators interviewed Darren, his behavior raised even more questions. He appeared nervous, insisting he had been home during the storm. But when asked for proof, he struggled to provide a solid alibi. His timeline seemed shaky, and he contradicted himself multiple times. Detectives noted his agitation, his inability to maintain eye contact, and the defensive edge in his voice. While none of this proved guilt, it reinforced the unease surrounding him. Later that afternoon, investigators reviewed footage from nearby traffic cameras. One camera, located at an intersection about a mile from Marina's neighborhood, recorded a car matching Darren's driving past, shortly after midnight, the height of the storm. The footage was grainy, but the shape and license plate pattern matched his vehicle. Darren had claimed he hadn't left his home. The footage told a different story. Meanwhile, Colt's presence remained a quiet but crucial factor. Child psychologists knew that children his age processed trauma very differently. His silence wasn't unusual, but it complicated the investigation. They could not treat him as a formal witness due to his age. Still, his behavior, his reactions, and the environment around him could guide detectives toward understanding what had happened. Colt had been in the hallway when the police found him, suggesting he had likely been awake or at least aware during the violence. Toys near the hall indicated he had been up during the storm. Detectives pieced together a preliminary timeline. Marina tried to settle in for the night. Sometime during the storm, someone she knew entered the house. A confrontation began in the kitchen. It escalated into a deadly struggle. And all the while, Colt had been only a few feet away. The investigation was no longer about whether Darren was involved. It was about proving how deep his obsession had grown and whether it had turned him into a killer in the shadow of the storm. The next phase of the investigation focused on understanding exactly what Colt had witnessed and determining how his limited, childlike perceptions could guide detectives closer to the truth. Because he was only 3 years old, no formal questioning could take place in the usual way. Instead, a child psychologist named Dr. Eva Montrose was brought in to gently observe him and help investigators interpret anything he might express indirectly. Her role wasn't to extract statements, but to uncover patterns in his reactions, gestures, and emotional responses that could point toward the person responsible for the violence in his home. Colt had been placed temporarily with Marina's parents, where he stayed in a calm environment away from the noise of the unfolding investigation. Even there, he remained unusually quiet. He did not speak about his mother, nor did he respond when adults mentioned the storm or the night before. He carried his blue toy truck everywhere, gripping it tightly as though it were a lifeline. Dr. Montrose noticed he often stared toward doorways, as if expecting someone to enter suddenly. These subtle signs revealed the depth of fear that lingered inside him. To help him express himself, Dr. Montrose used a collection of simple drawings, images of people, houses, objects, and facial expressions. She also provided a set of small figures representing adults, children, and common household roles. Colt showed little interest at first, moving the figures without purpose or holding them stiffly in his hands. But over time, he began arranging the pieces in ways that reflected fragments of memory. He placed 2 adult figures near a small model kitchen, pushed one figure over as if it had fallen, and positioned a child figure in the hallway. He didn't say a word, yet the arrangement mirrored the layout investigators had found inside Marina's home. The next phase of the investigation focused on understanding exactly what Colt had witnessed and determining how his limited, childlike perceptions could guide detectives closer to the truth. Because he was only 3 years old, no formal questioning could take place in the usual way. Instead, a child psychologist named Dr. Eva Montrose was brought in to gently observe him and help investigators interpret anything he might express indirectly. Her role wasn't to extract statements, but to uncover patterns in his reactions, gestures, and emotional responses that could point toward the person responsible for the violence in his home. Colt had been placed temporarily with Marina's parents, where he stayed in a calm environment away from the noise of the unfolding investigation. Even there, he remained unusually quiet. He did not speak about his mother, nor did he respond when adults mentioned the storm or the night before. He carried his blue toy truck everywhere, gripping it tightly as though it were a lifeline. Dr. Montrose noticed he often stared toward doorways, as if expecting someone to enter suddenly. These subtle signs revealed the depth of fear that lingered inside him. To help him express himself, Dr. Montrose used a collection of simple drawings, images of people, houses, objects, and facial expressions. She also provided a set of small figures representing adults, children, and common household roles. Colt showed little interest at first, moving the figures without purpose or holding them stiffly in his hands. But over time, he began arranging the pieces in ways that reflected fragments of memory. He placed 2 adult figures near a small model kitchen, pushed one figure over as if it had fallen, and positioned a child figure in the hallway. He didn't say a word, yet the arrangement mirrored the layout investigators had found inside Marina's home. Every detail aligned: his escalating obsession, Marina's attempt to distance herself, the emotional volatility of his messages, and his presence near the neighborhood that night. Even though Colt could not speak the truth, his silent reenactments provided the emotional clarity investigators needed to focus their efforts. He had been the only living witness to the confrontation, the struggle, and the final moments of his mother's life. While the legal system could not rely on the actions of a child this young, the detectives understood that his quiet movements had filled in the missing spaces of the puzzle. His innocence had uncovered what Marina had tried so hard to escape. With the evidence firmly in place, the investigation was prepared to push forward toward the inevitable conclusion waiting in its final chapter. With the evidence lined up in a clear and undeniable sequence, detectives prepared the final steps needed to bring the case to a close. The story that had begun quietly in a peaceful neighborhood now pointed unmistakably toward one man, whose obsession had slipped into cruelty and control. Darren Hale had become the primary suspect, not because of one single piece of evidence, but because every thread of the investigation, Marina's messages, his behavior at work, the deleted digital trail, the traffic footage, and the fingerprints on the back door, wove together into a picture of deliberate and escalating fixation. The only question that remained was how he would respond once confronted with the truth the investigators had uncovered. Officers located Darren at his apartment on a gray morning 2 days after completing the last round of forensic tests. He seemed unsettled when they arrived, pacing inside his living room as though expecting a knock on the door. His eyes were sunken with exhaustion, and his clothes looked as though he had thrown them on without thought. When detectives told him he was under arrest for the murder of Marina Ellison, he seemed to freeze for a moment before denying everything with a panicked intensity. But the calm, steady voices of the officers and the weight of the evidence left little room for his pleas. He was taken into custody without a struggle, though his expression stayed twisted with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something like desperation. During the trial that followed, prosecutors presented the case in a clear, careful sequence. They described Marina's attempt to pull away from Darren, the complaint she filed at work, and the growing pattern of unwanted attention. They detailed the stormy night, the forensic findings, and the timeline built from camera footage and phone data. The broken vase, the cracked phone, and the defensive wounds on Marina's arms painted a chilling picture of her final moments. Experts explained how the absence of forced entry implicated someone she recognized. Darren's purchase of gloves and a knife just days before the incident stood out as undeniable evidence of planning. Colt's involvement in the case remained delicate. His reenactments with the figures were not shown in court, but detectives referenced them as part of the investigative process that had led to re-examining certain pieces of evidence. His role was acknowledged with care, always protected, always treated with the understanding that his mind had witnessed something far beyond what any child should endure. He was present in the case not through words, but through the silent truth he had unknowingly revealed. The verdict came swiftly. Darren was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His obsession, once hidden behind workplace charm and quiet persistence, had transformed into a violence that cost Marina her life and left a scar on her small son's future. As he was led out of the courtroom, there was no remorse on his face, only a hollow look, as if he still could not comprehend how his own actions had brought him to that moment. In the months that followed, the town of Redbrook slowly returned to its routine, though the memory of Marina's tragedy lingered in the background. Neighbors planted flowers near her home as a quiet tribute. The daycare workers who had known Colt offered support to his grandparents, who had taken him into their care permanently. He grew slowly more responsive, though the events of that night remained tucked deep in his memory, softened only by time and gentle care. The story of Marina Ellison became a lasting reminder within the community. It showed how danger can hide behind a smile, how obsession can masquerade as affection, and how even the quietest town can hold shadows no one expects. It also became a testament to something else, the strength of a small child who witnessed more than he could understand, whose silence spoke louder than words, and whose presence provided the final clue needed to bring justice to a life cut short. Redbrook would never forget Marina, nor the storm that changed everything. And in the house with the white shutters, where light now fell peacefully across the rooms, her memory lived on, a warning, a story, and a silent echo of a truth uncovered in the darkest hour.